A millionaire, always cold and distant, never imagined that a simple glance would change everything. In a humble orphanage, he met a boy who awakened an inexplicable unrest within him. As he discovers more about the child, clues from the past begin to fit together in a frightening way. When the truth finally emerges, he realizes that his destiny was set from the beginning. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing, Richard Matthews adjusted his Italian tie as he stepped out of his latest model Mercedes-Benz. The strong New York sun reflected off the windows of the modest Tomorrow Star Orphanage, located in a simple neighborhood in Queens. His imported shoes crunched on the gravel of the makeshift parking lot, reminding him how far out of his comfort zone he was. "Let's get this over with," he muttered to himself, checking his platinum watch one more time. As the president of the country's largest business conglomerate, time was his most precious asset. This visit was just a formality for his company's new social marketing campaign. The orphanage director, Mrs. Evans, a lady with graying hair and a welcoming smile, greeted him at the entrance. Her hands, calloused from work, contrasted with Richard's firm and professional handshake. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Matthews. It's an honor to have you," she said, genuinely enthusiastic. "We never imagined you'd come personally to make the donation." Richard forced a polite smile. "I need to see where our investments will be applied, don't I?" His eyes scanned the peeling walls of the hallway. "Could you show me around the facilities?" As they walked, Mrs. Evans excitedly explained the orphanage's projects and needs. Richard feigned interest, making mental notes about possible angles for the advertising campaign. The noise of children playing grew louder as they approached the courtyard. "We currently have 42 children," explained the director, "each with their own special story." Richard politely interrupted. "Mrs. Evans, we don't need to go into personal details. I'm more interested in the structural part of—" His words died in his throat. Something captured his attention in the corner of the courtyard. Among all the children running and playing happily, a solitary little boy caught his eye. Sitting on a worn wooden bench, the boy was about 6 years old, with slightly wavy brown hair and a melancholic expression that seemed out of place on such a young face. "That boy?" Richard pointed discreetly, feeling an inexplicable unease. "Ah, that's Michael," Mrs. Evans replied, her tone softening. "He's been with us since he was a baby. He's a special child, very quiet and observant." Richard couldn't look away. There was something familiar about that boy, something that made his heart tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. The child played alone with a small notebook, drawing, something with total concentration. "Doesn't he play with the other children?" he asked, surprised by his own interest. "Michael is different. He prefers to be alone, observing the stars or drawing. Sometimes he spends hours looking at the sky, as if waiting for something or someone." The director's words stirred a strange sensation in Richard. He suddenly remembered Sarah, his late wife, and how she used to spend hours on the balcony of their mansion, observing the stars while caressing her pregnant belly. Can I talk to him?" he asked, his voice betraying an emotion he had long kept locked away. Mrs. Evans nodded, surprised by the change in the businessman's behavior. "Of course, feel free." Richard walked slowly towards the boy, feeling his legs grow heavy with each step. When he got close, Michael looked up from his notebook, and the businessman felt as if he was looking into a mirror of the past. Those eyes, they were identical to Sarah's. "Hi, Michael," he said softly, sitting down next to the boy. "Can I see what you're drawing?" The boy hesitated for a moment, but then turned the notebook. On the page was a drawing of stars connected by lines forming imaginary constellations. In the center of the drawing, a larger star shone, surrounded by small strokes that looked like rays of light. "It's very beautiful," Richard praised, feeling his throat tighten. "Do you like stars?" Michael nodded shyly. "My mum said I'm a little star," he spoke softly, his voice almost a whisper. "She told me that my dad will find me one day, because the stars always show the way home." Richard felt the world spin. Little Star was exactly what Sarah called the baby she carried during the long nights when they talked about the future. How could this be possible? Was it just a coincidence? "Michael," called Mrs. Evans, approaching. "It's snack time, dear." The boy carefully put away his notebook and stood up. Before leaving, he looked at Richard one last time, as if wanting to say something more. The businessman remained seated, watching the child walk away, while a torrent of emotions and memories invaded him. At that moment, Richard Matthews, the man known for his coldness in business, felt something awaken in his heart, a familiar yet frightening sensation, as if a lost piece of his soul had just clicked back into place. Richard couldn't sleep that night. Michael's words echoed in his mind as he paced restlessly through the silent corridors of his mansion in the Hamptons. Through the enormous glass windows, the stars seemed to be watching him, like silent witnesses to a past he had tried so hard to bury. "It can't be," he muttered to himself, pouring his third glass of whiskey. In his private office, he opened a long closed drawer. Inside, a velvet box held the last memories of Sarah. With trembling hands, Richard pulled out an old photograph. In it, Sarah smiled radiantly, one hand resting on her 6-month pregnant belly. Her eyes, identical to Michael's, shone with happiness. In the background, the starry sky she loved to contemplate. "Mr. Richard," the voice of Rose, the housekeeper, who had worked in the house for 2 decades, interrupted his thoughts. "Are you all right? I saw the light on—" "Rose," he called, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "Do you remember Sarah's last days?" The housekeeper entered the office, her wrinkled face showing concern. "Of course I do, sir. How could I forget? Mrs. Sarah was an angel." "What happened exactly? After she passed, what was done with the baby?" Rose sat in the armchair in front of the desk, her hands clasped in her lap, showing discomfort. "You never wanted to know. You were so devastated at the time. The doctors said the baby was born healthy, but you—" "I ran away," Richard completed, shame evident in his voice. "I didn't have the courage to face it. I simply left for overseas. And left everything in the hands of the lawyers. Mr. Paul, your lawyer at the time, took care of everything," Rose continued. "He said he would provide the best for the child since you weren't emotionally capable." Richard stood up abruptly, knocking over the whiskey glass. "I need to talk to Paul immediately." "But sir, it's almost 2 in the morning." "It doesn't matter. I need to know the truth, and Rose, don't mention any of this to Christine." The mention of his current wife made the housekeeper purse her lips. Christine Matthews, 20 years younger than Richard, was known for her controlling personality and her obsession with the status their marriage provided. In the master bedroom, Christine woke up to the sound of the discussion. "Richard, what's going on?" "Nothing, dear. Go back to sleep," he replied curtly, already dialing Paul's number. After 3 rings, a sleepy voice answered. "Richard, did something happen?" "Paul, I need you to find all the documents related to the birth of my child with Sarah, all of them, understood? Including the hospital records. Richard, that was over 6 years ago. Why now?" "Just do what I'm asking. Tomorrow morning I want everything on my desk." Christine, who had followed her husband to the office, watched the scene with growing irritation. "What's this story about a child? Richard, have you been drinking?" He hung up the phone and faced his wife. His eyes, normally cold and calculating, now burned with a determination she had never seen. "Christine, there are things from my past that you don't know, and it's time for me to know them myself." "You're scaring me," she said, approaching and trying to touch him. "Let's go back to bed. We'll talk calmly in the morning." Richard dodged her touch. "No, I've postponed this for too long. Today I met a boy at the orphanage, and something about him reminded me of Sarah." Christine's face hardened. "That ridiculous visit to the orphanage. I said it was a waste of time. Now you're having absurd ideas because of some random kid." "Don't talk like that," Richard's voice thundered through the office. "You don't know anything, Christine, and for the first time in years, I feel like I need to discover the truth." Rose, who was still nearby, watched the argument with apprehension. In her years of service, she had never seen the boss so upset. More than that, she had never seen him show so much interest in the child he believed he had lost along with Sarah. "I'll prepare some tea for you, sir," offered the housekeeper, giving Christine a significant look. "No need, Rose," Richard replied, grabbing his car keys. "I'm going for a drive. I need to think." At 2 in the morning? Christine questioned, indignant. Richard, you can't. Yes, I can, he interrupted her. And I will. When I return, I want the house quiet. As he drove aimlessly through the deserted streets of New York, Richard felt his heart beating erratically. The image of Michael mixed with memories of Sarah, creating a whirlwind of emotions he could no longer control. Without realizing it, he ended up stopping in front of the orphanage. The building was dark and silent, but the stars continued to shine in the sky as if guarding a secret he was about to discover. The next morning, Richard's office was buzzing with the early arrival of Paul, his lawyer for more than 2 decades. The gray-haired man carried an old folder, yellowed by time, his hands slightly trembling as he placed it on the mahogany desk. I found everything I could, Richard, said Paul, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. But I need you to understand, some decisions were made at a very delicate time. Richard, who hadn't slept, kept his eyes fixed on the folder. What decisions, Paul? What exactly are you trying to tell me? Before the lawyer could answer, Christine burst through the office door, impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit. Darling, did you forget our breakfast with the Andersons? It's an important contract. You said so yourself. Cancel it, Richard replied dryly without taking his eyes off the folder. Paul and I have urgent matters to discuss. Christine shot an icy look at the lawyer. Paul, excuse me, I need to talk to my husband in private. He stays. Richard's voice sounded authoritative. And you can leave, Christine. This doesn't concern you. The woman's face contorted in an expression of contained fury. Everything that affects you concerns me. I'm your wife, in case you've forgotten. And I won't allow this sudden obsession with some random kid to destroy everything we've built. Christine. Richard finally looked at her, his eyes flashing. For the last time, leave. After she left, slamming the door hard, Paul took a deep breath and opened the folder. These are the records from St. Mary's Hospital, where Sarah gave birth. The delivery was complicated, but the baby was born healthy. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. And then? You were in London, devastated. You weren't answering our calls. Sarah had left specific instructions in case something happened to her. Paul paused, choosing his words. She wanted the baby to be cared for by a trusted institution until you were ready to take him in. Tomorrow's Star, Richard murmured, the pieces starting to fit together. Exactly. It was a place Sarah knew well. She did volunteer work there. Mrs. Evans was her personal friend. Richard stood up abruptly, his hands pressed on the desk. Why did you never tell me this before? I tried, Richard. In the first few months, I tried several times, but you buried yourself in work, traveled the world, and then you met Christine. When you returned to the States, you seemed like a different, man-cold distant. You never brought up the subject of the baby again. Outside the office, Christine pressed her ear against the door, her face growing paler by the second. Quickly, she grabbed her cell phone and dialed a number. Dr. Sanders, I need that documentation we talked about. Yes, it's urgent. How much do you want? No, I need it today. It's about the Matthews Empire inheritance. Inside the office, Richard continued his investigation. I need more details about the birth, time, exact date, nurses who were present. Paul rummaged through the folder and pulled out an old certificate. Here, March 15th, 11:47 p.m. The head nurse was Mary Grace. She still works at the hospital. Richard picked up the phone. Rose, prepare the car. I'm going to St. Mary's Hospital right now. Wait, Paul interrupted him. There's one more thing you need to know. Sarah left a letter for you to be delivered when you were ready to read it. From a smaller folder, the lawyer pulled out a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed. Sarah's delicate handwriting was still perfectly preserved on the paper. Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. 6 years of buried secrets were about to come to light. Before he could open it, his cell phone rang. It was Mrs. Evans. Mr. Matthews, sorry to bother you, but something happened with Michael. He's asking for you. He had a dream last night. Said he saw his mother in the stars, telling him that his father had finally found him. A shiver ran down Richard's spine. How could the boy have dreamed something like that on this very night? I'm on my way there, he replied, tucking Sarah's letter into the inner pocket of his jacket. Please don't leave with Michael, okay? Paul watched him with concern. What are you going to do? Discover the truth, Whatever it takes. Sarah guided me to our son after all these years. I won't fail her again." What Richard didn't know was that Christine had already set her own plan in motion. In her private office, she examined recently forged documents that could completely change the course of this story. Her smile was cold as she put the papers in her Hermes bag. The sun was high when Richard arrived at tomorrow's Star Orphanage. His heart raced as he climbed the worn steps of the entrance, Sarah's unopened letter still weighing heavily in his pocket. Mrs. Evans was waiting at the door, her expression more serious than usual. "Mr. Matthews, I'm glad you came. Michael is in the back garden where the sunflowers are. It was his favorite place even before he knew that." "Before he knew what?" Richard asked anxiously. The director hesitated for a moment. Before he knew. It was his mother's favorite place too. Sarah used to spend hours here, tending to these flowers with our children. Richard felt his legs weaken. Each new piece of information seemed to confirm his suspicions even more. He followed the corridor to the garden, where he found Michael sitting on a small wooden bench, drawing in his notebook as always. "Hi, Michael," he called softly. The boy looked up and a shy smile lit up his face. "You came back, I knew you would. Mom told me in the dream." Richard sat down next to him, observing the drawing in the notebook. It was a woman with long hair, surrounded by stars, her hand extended towards two smaller figures. "Who are they in the drawing?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "This is my mum," Michael pointed to the central figure. "And these are me and my dad. In my dream, she was introducing us." A solitary tear ran down Richard's face. "Michael, do you remember anything about your mum? Anything at all?" The boy closed his eyes, concentrating. "I remember her smell. It was like flowers, and she sang a song to me every night about stars guiding the way back home." Richard felt his heart stop. It was the same song Sarah had composed during her pregnancy, a melody she swore the baby recognized, as he always moved when she sang. Before he could say anything more, he heard raised voices coming from the orphanage entrance. Christine had arrived, accompanied by a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. "Richard," she called, her shrill voice cutting through the peace of the garden. "We need to talk immediately." Michael instinctively shrank back, clutching his notebook tightly. Richard placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not now, Christine." "Yes, now," she insisted, approaching with firm steps. "I have documents here that prove this boy can't be your son." Dr. Sanders brought the complete medical records from the hospital. Mrs. Evans, who had followed Christine to the garden, intervened. "Ma'am, please, you're scaring the children." "I don't care." Christine brandished some papers. "Richard, look at this. These are the original hospital records. Sarah's baby didn't survive the birth." Richard stood up abruptly. "What are you talking about? Paul brought me documents this morning proving exactly the opposite." Dr. Sanders, a man with an oily appearance, cleared his throat. "Mr. Matthews, I have here the original certificate. What your lawyer has must be an altered copy." Michael watched the scene with wide eyes, his small hands trembling as he held the notebook. It was then that something unusual happened. Rose, the housekeeper, appeared in the garden, carrying an old box. "Boss," she called, out of breath. "I found this in the attic. Among Mrs. Sarah's things. You need to see this." Christine tried to intercept the housekeeper, but Richard was quicker. Inside the box was a diary, photographs, and most importantly, a series of letters exchanged between Sarah and Mrs. Evans during the pregnancy. "No!" Christine tried to snatch the documents from Richard's hands, but he firmly held her wrist. "Enough, Christine! What are you trying to hide?" At this moment, Michael stood up and, to everyone's surprise, began to sing softly. The melody was gentle, the words speaking of stars and the way back home. It was Sarah's song, note for note. Richard released Christine and turned slowly to the boy. How do you know that song?" "My mum sang it to me," Michael replied, simply. "Every night before bed, she said it was our special song that no one else knew." Mrs. Evans approached, tears in her eyes. "Sarah composed that song during her pregnancy. She told me she had never shown it to anyone except me," Richard completed, his voice trembling. "She sang to the baby every night, and I was the only one who knew the melody. Christine stepped back a few paces, her face a mask of fury and despair. Dr. Sanders, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control, tried to discreetly escape, but Rose blocked his path. "I think you have some explaining to do," said the housekeeper, her voice firm. "About these fake documents, for example." Richard finally opened Sarah's letter, his eyes quickly scanning the words his beloved had left. Each line confirmed what his heart already knew. Michael was his son, and Sarah had planned everything to protect him until Richard was ready to be a father again. The sunflower garden became the stage for a confrontation that had long needed to happen. Richard held Sarah's letter in one hand and the fake documents in the other, his eyes alternating between Christine and Dr. Sanders. "How much did you pay him?" Richard asked Christine, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "How much did it cost to try to erase my son's existence?" Christine raised her chin, defiant. "You don't understand, Richard. I did this for us. This brat will destroy everything we've built. Do you think the company's stock won't plummet when they discover that the great Richard Matthews abandoned a child for 6 years?" "I didn't abandon him," Richard thundered. "You and your accomplices manipulated. Everything from the beginning. The calls that never came through, the documents that disappeared, it was you, wasn't it?" Dr. Sanders began to back away towards the exit, but Paul, who had just arrived, stopped him. "Not so fast, Doctor. I think we have a lot to discuss about falsifying medical documents." Michael, frightened by the argument, approached Mrs. Evans, who hugged him protectively. Rose, the housekeeper, positioned herself next to them like an additional guardian. "Christine," Richard called, his voice now more controlled, "I want you to leave this house now. When you return to the mansion, your things will be in the garden." "You can't do this to me," she screamed, losing all composure. "I'm your wife, I have rights." "Rights?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "You conspired to keep a father away from his son. You used your influence to bribe hospital staff. You forged documents. Do you really want to talk about rights?" At this moment, Michael gently freed himself from Mrs. Evans's embrace and walked up to Richard. His small steps were firm, and there was an ancient wisdom in his eyes that made everyone fall silent. "Are you really my dad?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Richard knelt down to be at the boy's height. "Yes, Michael, and I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you." The boy took something out of his pocket. It was a small paper star, carefully folded. "Mom gave me this before she left. She said that when I found someone who knew our special song, it would be my dad." Christine let out a hysterical laugh. "This is ridiculous. A song and a piece of paper don't prove anything." "But this does," said Rose, pulling another envelope from the box she had brought. "These are the results of the DNA test that the boss secretly did last week. I took the samples to the lab myself." Richard took the envelope, surprised. In his rush to uncover the truth, he had completely forgotten that he had ordered the test. With trembling hands, he opened the result. 99% probability of paternity, he read aloud, tears freely flowing down his face. Michael, with the innocence of his age, simply extended his arms to Richard, who hugged him as if his life depended on it. The scent of sunflowers enveloped them, and for a moment everyone could have sworn they felt Sarah's presence there, blessing this reunion. "This isn't over," Christine threatened, composing herself. "I have evidence against you too, Richard. Years of suspicious transactions, secret meetings." "Enough!" Paul's voice cut through the air. "Christine, I suggest you leave now while you still can. Or do you want me to mention your own financial schemes? The accounts in the Cayman Islands? The embezzlement from the charitable foundation?" Her face paled. "How did you—" "Sarah asked me to protect her son's inheritance," Paul explained. "So yes, I've kept a complete dossier on all your activities since you married Richard. Now the choice is yours. Leave quietly or face the consequences." Christine looked one last time at Richard and Michael, still embracing amid the sunflowers. Her empire of lies was crumbling like a house of cards. Without saying another word, she spun on her heels and left hurriedly, dragging Dr. Sanders with her. "Dad?" Michael called softly, testing the word for the first time. "Can we go see the stars tonight?" Richard smiled through tears. "Of course, we can, son. And you can tell me all about the drawings you make of them." Mrs. Evans watched the scene with an emotional smile. Sarah always said that stars show the way back home. It seems she was right once again. Rose began organizing the scattered documents. "I'll prepare the blue room in the mansion, boss. The one overlooking the garden, as Mrs. Sarah always wanted for the baby." "Thank you, Rose," Richard replied, still embracing his son. "For everything. For keeping Sarah's memory alive. For saving these proofs. For not giving up on us." The Matthews mansion never seemed so alive. Rose ran from one side to the other, supervising the decoration of Michael's room, while Richard observed every detail with a mixture of anxiety and happiness. The walls, previously in a neutral tone, now displayed a delicate blue gradient that resembled the night sky, sprinkled with small luminous stars. "What do you think, son?" Richard asked, still getting used to the sweetness of that word on his lips. "We can change anything you want." Michael slowly spun in the center of the room, his eyes shining with enchantment. "It's like being inside the sky," he exclaimed, stopping to touch one of the stars on the wall. "Can I really sleep here?" "This room has always been yours," Richard replied, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Your mother planned it even before you were born." Rose entered, carrying an old box, her hands trembling slightly with emotion. "I found more of Mrs. Sarah's things in the attic, boss. I think Michael will like to see them." Sitting on the soft carpet of the new room, father and son began to explore the contents of the box. There was a photo album, some carefully folded baby clothes, and at the bottom, an object that made Richard catch his breath, a small telescope. "Sarah bought this when she was pregnant," he explained, running his fingers over the cold metal of the instrument. "She said you two would explore the stars together." Michael picked up the telescope with reverence. "Can we use it tonight? Mrs. Evans taught me some constellations, but I've never seen them up close like this." "Of course we can," Richard smiled. "In fact..." His sentence was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Paul entered the room moments later, carrying a folder. "Sorry to interrupt," said the lawyer, "but we need to resolve some legal issues, the custody papers." "Will I have to go back to the orphanage?" Michael asked, his voice small and frightened. Richard hugged him immediately. "No, son, never again. I'm here to officially register that you are a Matthews, my rightful heir. No one will separate us again." Paul smiled, pulling some documents from the folder. "Actually, I also brought something interesting that I found in the old hospital archives. Nurse Mary Grace kept a diary with records of all the births she attended. She wrote about the night you were born, Michael." Richard carefully took the diary, reading aloud. "March 15th, 11:47 p.m. The baby was born strong and healthy, with the same eyes as his mother. Sarah managed to hold him for a few minutes, long enough to sing her special song and give him the name Michael, which means, 'Who is like God?' Her last words were a promise that the stars would guide him to his father when the time was right." Michael snuggled closer in his father's embrace, silent tears running down his face. "She knew we would find each other." "Yes, son," Richard replied, kissing the top of the boy's head. "Your mother was always the wisest of us." Rose entered the room again, now bringing a tray with hot chocolate and cookies. "I thought our boy might like a snack while organizing his things." "Thank you, Rose," Michael smiled. Then shyly he asked, "Can I call you Grandma? It's just that at the orphanage I always wanted to have one." The housekeeper let the tray fall. Fortunately, Paul was quick enough to catch it. Tears welled up in the lady's eyes as she hugged the boy. "Of course you can, my little angel. Of course you can." Richard watched the scene with his heart overflowing. His house, once cold and empty, now filled with love and laughter. However, a shadow still lingered in his thoughts. "Paul," he called softly, while Michael showed his drawing notebook to Rose. "What about Christine? Has she made any threats?" The lawyer shook his head. "She took a flight to Europe this morning. Apparently she thought it better to accept a discreet settlement than face the consequences of her actions." "And Dr. Sanders? He's cooperating with the investigations. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he handed over all the original documents and confessed to the forgery scheme." Richard nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned his attention back to Michael, who was now enthusiastically explaining to Rose the meaning of each star in his drawings. "Dad," the boy called, Look, I drew our family. There's me, you, Grandma Rose, and Mom in the stars watching. Over us, Richard joined them on the carpet, observing the colorful drawing. Indeed, there was a bright figure above all the others, with a smile he knew so well. "It's perfect, son," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Completely perfect." The first week of Michael in the mansion brought changes that no one could have predicted. Richard, known for his impeccable punctuality and rigorous schedule, now adjusted his meetings to be able to take his son to school. The powerful businessman discovered that he much preferred helping with homework than attending business dinners. On that particular morning, Richard watched Michael preparing for his first day at the new school. The boy adjusted his uniform, tie with the same concentration his father dedicated to million-dollar contracts. "Nervous, son?" Richard asked, helping him with his backpack. "A little bit," Michael admitted, biting his lower lip exactly as Sarah used to do when she was anxious. "Oh, what if the other kids don't like me?" "Impossible not to like you," Rose replied, entering the room with a lunchbox. "Besides, I prepared your favorite cookies to share with your new friends." Michael's smile lit up the room. "Thank you, Grandma Rose. They're the best cookies in the world." On the way to school, Richard noticed that his son was unusually quiet, looking out the car window with a thoughtful expression. "Want to tell me what you're thinking about?" Michael hesitated for a moment. "Dad, do you think Mom would be happy to see me going to this school?" Richard felt his heart tighten. "I'm sure she would, son. In fact," he stopped the car in front of the school and took something out of the glove compartment. "I found this last night while organizing. Some old documents. It was a yellowed brochure for St. Francis Academy, the same school where Michael was enrolled. On the back there were notes in Sarah's handwriting. Best school for our little one. Great science program. Perfect for stargazing." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "She had already chosen this school for me. Your mother planned every detail of your life, Michael. She knew that one day we would all be together again." Before Michael could respond, a familiar voice caught his attention. "Michael! Michael!" It was Jack, his best friend from the orphanage, running towards him with a huge smile. Richard smiled as he saw the surprise on his son's face. "Surprise," he said. "I talked to Jack's parents, who adopted him last week. I thought it would be good for you to have a familiar friend nearby." Michael jumped on his father's neck, hugging him tight. "You're the best dad in the world." As he watched the two boys entering the school together, Richard received a message from Mrs. Evans. "Need to talk to you. Found more of Sarah's belongings at the orphanage." At the end of the afternoon, after picking Michael up from school and listening animatedly to all the stories about his first day, Richard headed to the orphanage. Mrs. Evans was waiting for him with a small, delicate box. "I found this hidden in an old drawer," she explained, handing the box to Richard. "Sarah left specific instructions for it to be opened only when Michael turned 7 or when you two reunited, whichever came first." Inside the box was a necklace with a small star-shaped pendant, identical to the one Sarah always wore. Along with it was a note. "For our little Michael, so that he always remembers that true love, like the stars, never really disappears. It just shines in different places." "There's one more thing," Mrs. Evans continued, her voice choked. "Sarah recorded a video weeks before she passed. She wanted Michael and you to watch it together." Richard held the flash drive she handed him as if it were the most precious object in the world. "Thank you, Mrs. Evans, for everything. For taking care of our son when I couldn't." "Sarah knew you would come back," she replied with a soft smile. "She always said that some people are like shooting stars. They need to get a little lost in the darkness before finding their true shine." Back at the mansion, Richard found Michael and Rose in the garden planting sunflowers. The boy had dirt on his face and a radiant smile. "Dad, Grandma Rose said that Mom used to plant sunflowers because they always look at the sun, just like she always looked at the stars." Richard joined them in the garden, the pendant and flash drive secure in his pocket. Tonight would be special. They would watch Sarah's message together, and he would give the necklace to his son. But for now, he would enjoy that simple moment of happiness, helping to plant the flowers that Sarah loved so much. Night fell gently over the Matthews mansion. Richard had prepared everything with special care, The home theater was ready, with comfortable pillows scattered on the couch. Rose had prepared hot chocolate and Michael's favorite cookies, leaving everything on a tray nearby. "Son," Richard called, sitting next to the boy, "I have two very special surprises for you today." Michael's eyes sparkled with curiosity as his father took the delicate star pendant necklace out of his pocket. "This necklace belonged to your mother," Richard explained, his voice soft. "She left it for you along with a very special message." Michael took the necklace reverently, his small fingers tracing the outline of the star. "It's just like the one she wears in the photos." "Exactly," Richard smiled. "And there's one more thing." He showed the flash drive. "Your mother recorded a video for both of us. Do you want to watch it?" The boy nodded, pressing the necklace against his chest. Rose, who was watching the scene from the door, discreetly wiped away a tear before withdrawing to give father and son privacy. Richard connected the flash drive to the television, and after a few seconds, Sarah's smiling face filled the screen. She was sitting in the sunflower garden at the orphanage, her star necklace shining under the sun. "My loves," she began, her sweet voice filling the room. "If you're watching this video, it means you've finally found each other, as I always knew you would." Michael moved closer to his father, who wrapped him in a protective hug. "Michael, my little one," Sarah continued, "you're probably quite grown up now. I want you to know that you were the greatest gift life ever gave me. From the first moment I knew of your existence, you became the brightest star in my sky." She paused, adjusting the necklace, the same one that now rested in Michael's hands. "Richard, my love," her gaze became more intense, "I know it must have been difficult. I know the pain may have made you pull away, but I also know that your heart was always bigger than any sadness. Our son has your eyes, you know, and I'm sure he has your heart too." Richard couldn't contain the tears that ran freely down his face. "I left this necklace with Mrs. Evans because it has a special meaning," Sarah explained. "Do you see this little star? If you look closely, you'll notice that it's actually formed by three smaller stars intertwined. It's the three of us, forever connected, no matter where we are." Michael examined the pendant more closely, discovering the delicate detail his mother mentioned. "Michael, when you feel homesick, hold this necklace and look at the stars. I'll be there watching over you." And Richard, Sarah smiled, that smile that had won his heart so many years ago. "Take care of our treasure. Teach him about the constellations as you taught me. Show him that love, like the stars, is eternal." She picked up a book beside her. "This is the diary where I wrote down all the moments of my pregnancy, all the dreams I had for our son. Mrs. Evans kept it for you. Michael, when you're reading it, you'll discover that your father has always been an extraordinary man. And Richard, through these pages, you'll know every precious moment we spent together, your son and I." Sarah looked directly at the camera, her eyes shining with contained tears. "Now I have to go, my loves, but remember, on the darkest nights, it's the stars that guide us back home. And you finally found each other, as I always knew you would." The video ended with Sarah blowing a kiss, her radiant smile frozen in the last frame. Michael, who had watched everything in silence, finally spoke. "Dad, can we go see the stars now?" Richard wiped away his tears and smiled. "Of course we can, son. In fact, I have an even better idea." He took Michael to the balcony of the master bedroom, where Sarah's telescope was set up, pointed at the night sky. "Your mother and I used to spend hours here," Richard explained, adjusting the telescope. "She always said that each star had a story to tell." "And what's the story of our star, Dad?" Richard helped his son look through the telescope. "Ours. It's the story of a family that, even separated for a time, never lost its shine. Because true love, Michael, is like the stars, eternal and infinite." The following months brought profound changes to the Matthews family's life. Richard, previously known only as the ruthless businessman, was now regularly seen at school events, always with a proud smile as he watched Michael's performances. The man who used to live only for business discovered that his greatest achievement was watching his son grow up. On a particularly special Saturday afternoon, Richard organized a surprise that would change not only his family's life, but that of many others. The mansion's garden was decorated with sunflowers and small lights that mimicked stars, and several important guests gathered for an announcement. "Are you sure you don't want to tell me what it is, Dad?" asked Michael, adjusting the bow tie. That matched his father's. Richard smiled, affectionately messing up his son's hair. "Have patience, little astronomer. You'll understand soon." Rose, elegant in a navy blue dress, approached with Mrs. Evans, who had become a constant presence in the family's life. "Everything's ready, boss," announced the housekeeper, now officially Michael's doting grandmother. "The guests are arriving." Among those present were important businessmen, politicians, and, to the surprise of many, several children from tomorrow's Star Orphanage, all dressed in new clothes and with hopeful smiles. Richard climbed onto the small stage set up in the garden, holding Michael's hand. The boy proudly wore the necklace with the star pendant that had belonged to his mother. "Good afternoon, everyone," Richard began, his voice carrying an emotion that would have been unthinkable in public before. "A few months ago, my life changed completely when I reunited with my son, Michael. It was a gift that destiny, and especially Sarah, my late wife, saved for the right moment." He paused, looking lovingly at his son beside him. "Michael taught me that there are treasures much more valuable than any bank account, and today, in memory of Sarah and in celebration of the love that reconnected us, I have a special announcement to make." Paul, the lawyer and now close friend of the family, handed Richard a folder with documents. "I am officially creating the Sarah Matthews Foundation," he announced, causing murmurs of surprise among the guests. "An institution that will have as its main objective to support orphanages throughout the United States, ensuring quality education and opportunities for all children who, like Michael, are waiting for a family." The orphanage children applauded enthusiastically, while Mrs. Evans wiped away tears. "But there's more," Richard continued, smiling at Michael. "The Foundation's headquarters will be built next to tomorrow's Star Orphanage and will include a complete astronomical observatory, open to all children who want to learn about the stars." Michael hugged his father tightly, barely able to contain his joy. "Just like Mom wanted?" "Exactly as she dreamed, son," Richard replied. "I found the plans in her diary. Sarah had designed every detail of this project. Jack, Michael's best friend from his orphanage days, now also happy with his new family, ran up to the stage to hug his friend. The two boys immediately began making plans for future stargazing nights. Rose approached Richard, her eyes shining with pride. "Mrs. Sarah would be so happy, sir. You've transformed the pain into something so beautiful." "It wasn't me, Rose," he replied, watching Michael and Jack animatedly discussing constellations. "It was her love that guided us here. Sarah knew that one day her dream would come true." Mrs. Evans joined them, carrying an old box. "I found this just this morning, hidden on a high shelf at the orphanage. I think now is the right time to open it." Inside the box were dozens of drawings made by Sarah, all showing the project for the observatory and educational spaces that would now become reality. On each page, small notes revealed her dream of creating a place where children could learn to look at the stars and find hope. "Look, Dad," Michael called, pointing to the sky that was beginning to darken. "The first star of the night." Richard hugged his son, feeling a peace he had never imagined possible. The scent of sunflowers filled the air, and for a moment everyone could have sworn they felt Sarah's presence, smiling proudly from the sky she loved so much.